Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to this webinar today. My name is Sarah Panik, and I'm an Education USA advisor at the US-UK Fulbright Commission. And in this evening's webinar, we are going to be talking about postgraduate study in the US. And this will include a brief overview of choosing, funding, and applying for US study. And at the end, we'll have time for questions and answers. So I will ask that you hold any of your questions until the end, just in case I cover any of them off in the presentation. And also to let you know, this session will be recorded. And so I will be emailing the recording of the session to you, hopefully tomorrow, if not tomorrow, next week. And so you will have access to it to kind of refer back to, or in case for any reason you end up needing to drop off early or anything like that. So without further ado, I'd like to start out by telling you a little bit more about myself. So as I said, my name is Sarah, and as you might be able to tell from my accent, I am not originally from the UK. I am from Chicago in the US, where I completed both my undergraduate and postgraduate degree. I have, however, been living in the UK for the past 7 years, and I've been working at Fulbright for the past 5 years. And I'm really delighted to be here this evening presenting this webinar to you. And to tell you a little bit more about who we are, we at the US-UK Fulbright Commission were established more than 70 years ago in the aftermath of World War II by a man named Senator Fulbright. Senator Fulbright himself studied in the UK as a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, and he thought that the best way to avoid a third world war would be to encourage cultural and educational exchange. So we were born from that. And we are a not-for-profit organization that's jointly funded by the US and the UK government to promote peace and cultural understanding through educational exchange. So how exactly do we do that? So one of the ways that we do that is by offering scholarships for postgraduate study and research in the US and the UK. And then we also offer an advisory service to assist students, parents, and advisors with applying for US universities. And the advisory service is part of the Education USA network, which is a US Department of State network of over 400 international student advising centers throughout the world. And our aim as Education USA advisors is to offer free, unbiased, up-to-date advice to help UK students study in the US. And we are actually the only official source of US study in the UK. And you might be wondering why students choose to go to the US for their studies each year. And there are thousands of students who choose to do so. And there are a number of reasons for this. And at the postgraduate level, you'll see a number of these reasons up here on the screen. The first reason here is the wide selection that's available. So there's over 1,700 universities that offer postgraduate degrees in the US, compared to about 120 in the UK. Among those 1,700 institutions, there's a lot of variety in the institutions themselves and also amongst the academic departments. So UK students like the ability to be able to choose among all that variety to find the best university for them. Going to the US also offers students the opportunity to internationalize their CV. So employers cite cross-cultural experience as an attractive quality. And it's helpful to have diverse experiences and demonstrate that independence that's necessary to study abroad when internationalizing your CV. It also gives you the opportunity to take part in global networking. So there's an unparalleled opportunity to create global networks, not only with American faculty and institutions, but also with the diverse colleagues which make up many US universities. Going to the US also offers practical experience. There are many opportunities for hands-on research, internships, and teaching opportunities at the postgraduate level. You also have the chance to expand your horizons because living and studying in another country expands your worldview and may expand the opportunities available to you in the future. And last, but certainly not least, and one that may be surprising to some of you, is that a final top reason to study in the US is the funding opportunities that are available. There are a lot of funding schemes and scholarships available at the postgraduate level, which we'll talk about in more depth later on in this presentation. I also want to touch on some of the key differences between the US and the UK postgraduate programs. So typically in the US, programs are longer. It tends to be about 2 years for a master's program, although there are some one-year programs available. And PhD programs tend to be about 4 to 6 years. Though again, that may be more or less depending on the program or the department. A PhD will typically include an integrated master's, which means that you'll be doing coursework for the first year or two. And even if you already have the master's, a master's degree, if you're pursuing a PhD, you'll still be kind of doing this coursework. So you can use that time to sharpen skills, gain more experience teaching, or doing research. It's typically not an optional component of the degree. In the US, there aren't really any pure research degrees. Programs do include coursework at the postgraduate level. And then something else to keep in mind is while there are over 1,700 institutions, there are no set fees or standard application deadlines. So there's a lot of variance between universities and departments. Postgraduate programs are also organized by departments rather than by a supervisor. And you don't necessarily need to know your supervisor beforehand, especially since some programs are more interdisciplinary, which means that you might have multiple supervisors or even a committee. And you don't necessarily need to have an in-depth research proposal at the time of application. They often expect you to figure this out throughout the program. And then one last thing to keep in mind if you're applying to the US is that law and medicine is actually studied at the postgraduate level in the US as opposed to the undergraduate level. So now we'll just take you through a brief timeline of what you should expect if you want to apply into US universities. So we typically recommend beginning to research programs about 12 to 18 months before you hope to enroll, and then finalizing the selection of where you'll be applying around 10 to 12 months before you plan to enroll. And around that same time, you might be taking any required admissions exams and beginning your applications. And then about 8 to 10 months before, you'll put together your application and you'll submit according to the deadlines of the different institutions. And then about 4 to 7 months before you plan to enroll in the springtime, you'll expect to hear back from the universities that you applied to with their admissions decisions. And then based off of where you were accepted, you'll notify the university of your decision and you'll apply for a visa about 1 to 3 months before enrollment. And we do have all sorts of resources available on our website for all of this process, but also for this pre-departure process, including travel advice, living arrangements, campus life, etc. And then you'll typically begin your studies around mid-August to early September, which is slightly earlier than you would here in the UK. So now I'd like to talk about choosing a program. As I said, there's over 1,700 institutions offering postgraduate programs. So there are a lot of options and each institution and department will be different. So how exactly do you go about narrowing down where you want to actually apply? So a term that we focus on a lot at the Fulbright Commission is this idea of fit. And what that means is that we want for students to find a program that's really going to be the best fit for you and your personal and academic interests. And this is the first step in the choosing process, is locating what factors are important to you. And this means that you're not just going to be looking at universities that you've heard of straight away, or ones that maybe you've seen mentioned in movies or television programs, or even just focusing on the ones that have the highest rankings. But instead, you'll be thinking about a variety of different factors to really get to what's important to you when choosing an institution. And so some different factors that you may wish to consider are up here on the screen. So one thing to think about might be the type of institution. Are you looking at, are you most interested in a public university or a private university? You may also be looking at the program type, which at the postgraduate level is arguably more important than the institution itself. You'll want to consider your career goals, qualifications, any concentrations that you might be interested in. You'll want to think about if you want a program with funded internship opportunities, maybe a program where you can get grant writing experience. You'll also want to be looking at the academic department, because choosing the right department is almost as important as choosing the right university at the postgraduate level. It's going to influence so much of your experience in the US. At the postgraduate level, academic departments generally handle admissions, they design course structure for students, they monitor a student's progression through the program. And so it's essential to research the department to find the right academic home for you. And departments can vary drastically in terms of their areas of faculty expertise, what types of elective courses or concentrations they offer, whether they're more tightly focused or more interdisciplinary, may have different sizes, different atmospheres, and they may also have different opportunities for teaching, research, conference attendance, internships. And so all of those are things to think about. And then, perhaps superficially, but location is also an important thing to think about. It's the US is a massive country, which spans 6 different geographic zones. So you'll want to be thinking about things about, would you prefer to be in an urban environment or a rural environment? What kind of climate do you want to be in? If you are somebody that hates really cold winters and lots of snow, you may be wanting to avoid the Northeast or the northernmost parts of the US. Or on the other hand, if you're somebody who really doesn't like the hot weather, you'll probably be looking to avoid the South. You'll also want to think about things like access to transportation options, or maybe centers of excellence in your field. So for instance, maybe you're very passionate about political science. You might be looking to go to Washington, DC, or maybe you're interested in the field of finance and you're looking to go to New York. And then another thing to think about is the different extracurricular opportunities that are available, in different parts of the US. And if there's a particular extracurricular that you have an interest in, then it might be that you are going somewhere where that extracurricular activity is focused on. And then lastly, here on the screen is finances. And we're going to be talking about this a lot more in depth later on in the webinar. But if funding is something that's important to you in order to go to the US, then this needs to be part of your choosing process right from the beginning. Oftentimes especially funding that comes from universities, is awarded and applied for alongside the application process. So you don't only want to just start thinking about this after you've already applied and been accepted, because at that point, it's likely going to be too late, and we wouldn't want that to lead to disappointment for you down the line. So you'll be thinking about this from the beginning. We always say, follow the money. And so if you need funding, pursue postgraduate study in the US, you'll want to make sure that you're looking for those opportunities from the very start. So with that in mind, and so many different factors to consider, how might you go about narrowing down your options? And on our website, which you may have already seen, but if you haven't, definitely check it out. There's a page about choosing a university, and this includes a list of links to helpful search engines such as Petersons or gradschools.com. And you'll be able to use these search engines and all those different factors to start narrowing down your choices. You may also choose to use things, people, such as people who have taught you previously. See if they have any advice or opinions on institutions that might be a good fit for you. You can also speak with professionals or colleagues in your field to see if they know of any particular institutions in your discipline. And you might also want to think through the work of scholars that you've previously read. Is there anyone that you've identified is doing the kind of research that you would like to do? Where are they teaching? What are their colleagues working on? And using all of these different tools, you're going to want to narrow down your choice of universities to about 10 or so institutions. So just as an example, this is Petersons, which is one of the search engines that's linked on our website. And it's particularly helpful in helping you decide and rank what factors are important to you in choosing a university. So for an example here, we'll use this tool to look for graduate level schools and programs in a particular field. So in our case, we'll look for programs in anthropology. And you'll see here that the search engine pulls up the results of different universities with departments or programs in anthropology. And on the left sidebar here, you can see that you can select a variety of different factors like location, tuition fees, school size, and that can help you narrow down the list further. So once you've narrowed your choice down to about 10 universities of interest, you'll start researching them further on the university website and reaching out to them directly with the ultimate goal of selecting about 4 to 6 institutions where you'll actually submit an application. You'll want to go to the university website so that you can find out more information about the faculty. Some might even list the CVs of the faculty, their research interests, and a list of their publications. You can also find contact information for specific professors to reach out to so that you can see if they're still working on something that interests you. You may also wish to reach out to current grad students. They might be able to provide valuable insight into their experience as a graduate student at a particular university. They can talk to you about what types of projects they're working on, how close the relationships are between professors and graduate students, perhaps how close they are with their supervisors or what the campus culture is like. Maybe even more broad questions about what the local area is like, how to find a good apartment, the cost of living. And departments can usually put you in touch by email with a current student. So that can be a good way of determining what it's like to really study there. So that's an overview of some of the main reasons why you might want to study in the US, and also a guide to the choosing process and how to determine your fit at particular universities and programs. And doing that in-depth research in the choosing process is really important. Once you get familiar with the programs that you're looking at, you can really then put together the most competitive application possible for them. And the more competitive your application, the better your chances are at securing funding. So the more time that you spend in the research process, the more benefit that it will bring you in the application process. So in this next section, I'll bring you through the main components of completing an application. And something to keep in mind as I go through this section is that the detail is really going to vary depending on the type of program that you're applying for. If you are somebody who is applying for an MBA, the detail of that application is going to be very different than somebody who's applying for a program in molecular physics. But with all of that being said, there are some components that universities will be looking for as a whole. So we'll focus on kind of some of those broader picture ideas. So first and foremost, US universities will look for your academic achievement. That's going to first be measured by your undergraduate degree, or if applicable, your postgraduate degree. And then if required, they'll also be looking at any admissions exam scores. Most universities are going to want to see at least a 2.2 on a bachelor's degree, but you can always contact individual departments or programs about whether your qualifications are sufficient to be considered for admissions. They're not necessarily going to have strict entry requirements, but they should be able to at least give you an approximate idea of whether your academic profile is roughly in line with their usual admitted student. Some other things that are going to be important in your application are going to be reasons for pursuing a postgraduate degree at their institution and how it helps towards your goals, that kind of academic fit piece. They'll also be looking at any kind of relevant work experience or coursework and any extracurricular involvement. US universities like to see a pattern of relevant work and study experience that lay a strong academic and practical foundation for your studies, as well as your ability and interest in being involved both in and outside of the classroom. US campuses tend to be very lively places, and so they want to see the personality of their applicants coming out. It could also be that they may want to know why you want to study in the US specifically for your degree. And there's not necessarily a standard process for all applications. It will vary by university, but these components that you see up here on the screen are going to be kind of some of the main components. So I'll take you through them briefly now, and then I'll take you through a few of them in a bit more detail in the following slides. So as I said earlier, each university will set its own deadlines and application requirements. So as you're doing your research, you'll want to make sure that you're making notes of all those different components to help keep track of it all. But most applications will follow a similar format, and you will be able to reuse or adapt the materials that you prepare for each. So most are going to include an application form that has your basic information about, name, email, birthday, all of that kind of thing. Some institutions are going to require an admissions exam score, which will be sent to the university by the organization that administered the test. We'll talk about that in a bit more detail very soon. They'll require a transcript, which is a listing of your academic marks. You can usually get this from your current university, or wherever you've already completed your degree, if you've already completed one. You can usually get it from the department or the university or the registrar's office. They'll also typically require a personal statement that will describe your academic interests, your professional and personal goals, and relevance experience. And that will also be an opportunity to put forth any personal history or context and sell yourself to the program. You'll also typically be asked for 2 to 3 letters of recommendation. The university may provide some loose guidelines for selecting referees. For example, maybe one from an academic, one from a professional referee. Regardless of who it is that they require, you'll want to make sure that you choose someone who knows you well, both in and out of the classroom. And again, we'll go into more detail of this in the upcoming slides. You may also be asked for a CV or a resume. that lists your professional and extracurricular accomplishments. And then depending on what program it is that you're applying for, you may be required to do an interview. This is quite common for MBA programs and occasionally also for research degrees. Or if you're doing a program in the arts, you may have an audition that's required. Art students may also be asked to submit a portfolio of work, while students who are doing a research-focused degree might be asked to submit a writing sample. And finally, an application fee of about $50 to $100 per application. And one thing that you'll want to think about when you're choosing universities is how your academic profile compares to the other applicants. So how do universities measure you up as a potential colleague or student? So you'll want to consider things like your grades, your UK qualifications, also any test scores, so those US admissions exams, if they're required. You'll think about any research that you've done, perhaps a dissertation as part of your undergraduate degree. You'll also think about your work experience. So again, this will vary depending on the program. For an MBA, work experience could be very important. For other programs, it might not be so important. And then you see here on the screen, we have something called the X factor. And as you might imagine, that is not referring to the show, the television program. What it's referring to is really anything that makes you stand out to help you determine where you will be likely be admitted or competitive for funding. So if you're an international student, perhaps you really had a really unique undergraduate program, and you can make a strong case as to why you would bring something unique to their program, because US universities are looking to build a cohort of an interesting mix of ideas and people on their program. And just as an example of that, for instance, I have a colleague who's from the UK and pursued her postgraduate degree in the US, and she chose to go to Wyoming. And she was the only British student in her class in that program that year, perhaps maybe the only British applicants. So that, that really stood out to the committee of people that were looking at her application. So that was kind of her X factor. And now to talk a little bit more about these admission exams, these admission tests. So admission tests act as a method of evaluation due to the lack of a national curriculum in the US. So they help kind of level the playing field a little. And it just means that it's something that if a program requires you to take an admissions exam, it just means that all of the applicants that are applying to the program have taken the same admissions exam, and they can kind of compare applicants in that way. So there are a number of different exams that you may have heard of. Perhaps the most common one that you may have heard of is the GRE, which is a graduate record exam, which measures your verbal reasoning, quantitative reasoning, critical thinking, and analytical writing skills. The GRE is the one that's required by most master's programs. You may have also heard of the GMAT, which is used by a number of MBA programs and business programs. The LSAT is another one that's used for JD programs, although not for LLM law programs, which instead require a first degree in law. And then there's also the MCAT for medical admissions and MD programs. Now, these exams tend to be quite different. So what we're used to here in the UK, they tend to be multiple choice exams. They tend to be lots of multiple choice questions under a strict time limit. So that's just something to keep in mind. And in terms of how important the standardized tests are in the admissions decision, it really depends. So some universities might not require these exams at all. And so if you're somebody who doesn't want to take an exam, it might be that you are applying to programs that just don't require it. For others, the exam might factor into their decision, but perhaps they're more interested in looking at your transcript and your personal statements. It could be that some programs are looking at particular aspects of the exam. Maybe they're more interested in analytical writing and verbal reasoning scores than how you did on the quantitative reasoning section. It really just depends. If you're really interested, you can always ask an institution how much weight is given to the exams when you're doing your research on these institutions. You'll want to make sure that you take the appropriate test when you're taking these exams, and again, confirm whether you need to take the test at all by consulting the website of each university where you plan to apply. And make sure that you're paying close attention to the university's application deadline so that you can plan your exam schedule accordingly. Making sure that you register early for exams, which leaves you the option to retake the exam if necessary. We do recommend that you properly prepare for the exam, that you prepare for in advance. There are a lot of free preparation materials available online, as well as the option to kind of buy study guides, a lot of kind of free practice tests available online. And with COVID over the last couple of years, a lot of these exams are trying to make the exam as accessible as possible. So the GRE and the GMAT, for example, even offer to the option to take the exam at home. So there is a possibility to do that if that is something that you prefer. And to talk a little bit more in depth about the personal statement, this is actually one of the most important parts of the application, and it's very different from your UCAS personal statements. So it's not like your UCAS personal statement, but it is an opportunity to showcase what you can bring to a US university. So it's not an in-depth research proposal, although some universities may ask for separate research statements that outline your research interests and future plans. But what it is a statement that helps kind of reveal your individual character, your motivation, your future goals, and perhaps your interest in that particular university or program or field. And some universities, instead of requesting a personal statement, might actually ask for an essay or answers to some specific essay questions. Or they might just kind of ask you to address something specific. So you'll just want to make sure that you're checking the requirements for each of the institutions where you apply very carefully. Since there is no set structure for writing a personal statement, you do have the opportunity to be creative and make yourself stand out. So some students choose to start with a quote or an anecdote describing how they became interested in their field of study. Others use a central theme to link and describe their experiences and future plans for their studies and career. There are all sorts of different ways to approach it. And on our website, in the section under personal statements, we do have some examples of personal statements that other students have written in the past. So you are able to kind of take a read through some of those and see how they might be a little bit different from personal statements that you have written previously. Another thing to keep in mind is that this isn't the time for modesty. It is the time to sell yourself as an applicant. So, be proud of your achievements and be proud of what you've accomplished when you're talking about yourself. And that goes hand in hand with the letters of recommendation. And so you'll also likely be required to gather 2 to 3 letters of recommendation. You'll need to ask a variety of people who know you well. The university may provide some loose guidelines, such as one reference being from an academic, one from being from a professional referee. If you do have multiple referees to choose from, you'll want to choose someone who knows you well, both in and out of the classroom. And it would also be ideal to choose referees that can complement your application package and also each other. And so if you have somebody that's able to kind of highlight one aspect of you, then you can choose somebody else who can highlight a different aspect of you and speak to different parts of what you can bring to the table, so that you get that good balance. So you'll have a balance of kind of classroom and professional, research, and extracurricular. It's not the worst idea to meet with your referee in advance to discuss the letter. You may even choose to give them a copy of your application or your transcript or your CV, so they kind of have that background. It's probably worth telling them the reasons for doing a postgraduate degree in the US or in your chosen field, perhaps why you're interested in those particular universities in particular, and any of your future goals. You'll want to make sure that your referee is aware of deadlines and any paperwork that needs to be completed. Now, these letters are used as a marketing tool for you as an applicant. And you are very welcome to make suggestions for the content of the letter, but it's really important that you don't see the letters before they get sent off to the university. And typically in the application process, there will be some type of box that asks you to kind of waive your rights to see the letters. And so if you do have a box like that, we do highly recommend that you waive your rights to see the letters, because it just gives them more credibility in the eyes of the institution that's reading them. You might direct your referees to mention things like your ability to succeed at the postgraduate level, observations about your performance, or your ability to positively contribute, any leadership abilities, any aspects of your character you want them to highlight, as well as a passion for your subject of choice. And as I mentioned with the personal statement, you'll want to encourage referees to avoid being restrained or too modest. American referees tend to write in a very enthusiastic tone, using positive and descriptive language to discuss the applicant both in and out of the classroom. And so you'll want to bear in mind what's being written about your American counterparts when preparing your UK referees to write their letters. So now that we've touched on choosing a university and what that application process is like, I'd like to talk to you about funding your studies. And as you might imagine, funding is one of the top things that we get asked about. And one of the misconceptions that I want to address right here is that people assume that the US is always more expensive. But the good news is that there's actually a significant amount of funding available at the postgraduate level, particularly if you are willing to be flexible and go into the process with an open mind. So where is this money? And there are 4 types of funding for study in the US. So the first type is just personal and family funds. There is a culture in the US of saving and paying for university in a way that we don't have in the same way here in the UK with the loan-based system. And so in the US, there is typically an expectation that you will make a contribution to your studies. But that being said, there is a lot of funding available, and US universities tend to be the best resource for this funding. There's two of the most common types of university-based funding are fellowships, which are outright grants that allow a recipient to focus solely on their own work. And there's also something called assistantships, which are offered in return for services provided to the department, either teaching, research, lab supervision, maybe working in a campus office in exchange for a fees waiver, health insurance, and maybe a stipend. Assistantships tend to be renewable year to year if the student maintains specified academic standards, though the terms of assistantships will vary dramatically between universities and between departments, and they also often depend on the available grants as well as the field and the department need. So this is why it's always important to ask the department or the program about this kind of funding when you're choosing where to apply. More funding does generally tend to be available for PhDs and students that are in a research-focused master's than for professional degree students. And it also varies by subject area, whereas the sciences tend to receive more funding than programs in the humanities. But it doesn't mean that funding isn't available in those other areas. It just means that more funding tends to be available in some areas than others. You'll want to make sure that you're checking with multiple offices about funding opportunities. So you'll want to check with the department specifically. If the university has a graduate school, maybe checking with the graduate school as well, and also with the financial aid office. Sometimes not, the funding that can be in those 3 different places and might not be in one centralized place. So it's important to kind of check and exhaust all those different options. In addition to funding from US universities, you can also seek funding from external funding bodies. And so this type of funding tends to be kind of niche scholarships, institutions that are separate to the universities, such as companies, charities, or foundations that offer funding for students to complete their studies. And then as a last resort, we have here loans. So just to be aware, in order to get a loan in the US, most US lenders require a US citizen to co-sign on the loan. And so if you're looking at loans as an option, most UK citizens tend to take out private loans from a UK bank. However, we would highly encourage you to examine the terms and interest rates closely if this is something that you're choosing to do, because the interest rates tend to be quite high. Sometimes the payback terms require you to start paying back the loan before you've even completed your degree and before you're earning any money. And so it can be quite tricky. If you are an American or a dual US-UK citizen, you can take out a loan from a US lender and you can apply for US federal loans through FAFSA. So as you might imagine from all of these sources of funding, the university funding and the external funding bodies tend to be the preferred options since they tend to offer money that doesn't have to be paid back. And you may wish to consider a funding strategy to try and lower your costs and manage your expenses. There's a few different approaches that you could take with this. One could be to reduce the costs of living. It's going to be cheaper to live in a rural area than it is to live in an urban area. Same as in the UK, it costs more to live in London than it does to live in Lancaster, for instance. You could also look to lower the tuition costs. So public universities, which means state-funded universities, generally have lower costs than private universities. However, private universities might have more funding, and funding will vary by department within each university. So you just kind of have to weigh those different things there. You could also, as we've already discussed, look for university funding. So in addition to the ways that we've already discussed, you could perhaps get creative, seek funding outside of your program in perhaps an interdisciplinary matter. So for instance, let's say you are interested in architecture and you have a particular interest in environmental architecture and making buildings more green. It might be that in addition to seeking funding from the architecture department, that you're also reaching out to the environmental studies department to see what type of funding they might be able to offer you to complete your degree. So you might not necessarily be able to use all of these strategies in one go. As I mentioned, you might find that universities with lower tuition have fewer funding opportunities for example. But being aware of the different factors at play can kind of help you put together a strategy for funding. And just as an example here, so I've got two universities here up on the screen. Boston University, for example, the cost of attendance within their Department of Education and Human Development is over $79,000 per year with tuition, room and board, and other fees. Compare that to an MA at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, where tuition and off-campus finances would be about $25,000 less. It's the same city, but with great variance in tuition and fees. So, perhaps being open-minded about the different institutions can already help with huge cost savings. And something else to be aware of is that sometimes when universities are this close to each other, they might actually have links and relationships with each other. So it might be that even if you're going to UMass with that cheaper tuition, that you might be able to take classes at Boston University. So those are just some different things to think through. So now we can take a little look at a few examples of how to identify these funding opportunities. So as I said already, for university funding, the best resource is going to be that university website, the department page, the graduate school, and the financial aid pages, making sure that you're checking all three in case not all the funding opportunities are advertised centrally. You'll want to see what they say. Do they have much funding available? Universities do generally try to give you an accurate but conservative measure of how much funding they offer. And if the information isn't available online, it might suggest that they can't offer a lot of financial support, but it is worth getting in touch with the departmental administrator or the director to inquire. You'll also want to think about whether you're going to be competitive for funding at that particular institution. You can also speak to current students about how competitive funding really is, perhaps what their assistantship involves, what the work-life balance is like, and get the inside scoop. You may also wish to find out how many assistantships are there available. Are they full or partial? And if possible, find out on what basis they award assistantships. So is your GRE score factored into it, or is it going to be more on the basis of your other academics or perhaps your prior experience? You'll also want to find out if there are extra requirements that you need to fulfill in order to be considered for assistantships. You might be automatically considered, but in some cases, applicants might need to submit an additional essay or a resume. So now we're going to see an example of what you can look out for. So this is the website of the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, which is a top public research university. You'll see we've highlighted some key points in their section about fellowships and assistantships and how to identify when a university has funding available. And as you can see, most universities who are generous with funding will make it quite obvious on their websites. So in the Department of Political Science, they note that most students in the department are supported by fellowships and assistantships. They also explain that duties typically range from 10 to 15 hours per week, and they list the type of duties that you can expect. They also mention the eligibility for a variety of fellowships And they also note that Chapel Hill has a lower cost of living. So you can see here that there's 2 points from that funding strategy that we've talked about, both in terms of university funding and also that lower cost of living. And now I want to talk about an example of an external funding body. So one example of external funding is through the Fulbright Awards, a scholarship from an external funding body. So that's actually offered here at the Fulbright Commission by some of my colleagues. So the Fulbright Commission, as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, is funded by the UK and the US governments with a mission of promoting mutual understanding through educational exchange. So there's funding available for UK students to study and conduct research in the US and vice versa at the postgraduate level. Now, the number of awards for study does fluctuate each year. And this year, applications are actually opening in March with a deadline for the end of May for US studies starting in autumn of 2023. So yes, it's quite early before you even likely applied to your US universities. There are a variety of awards available. Some are going to be for the first year only. Others are partner awards that are fully funded, and you can find out more information on the Fulbright website. And just something to be aware of with this is that the timeline for these awards has changed. And so if you are looking to start your studies in autumn of 2023 and you are interested in applying for one of these awards, the applications are opening in early March, so very soon, and closing at the end of May. The reason for this is because they're going to be offering something called an IIE placement model, which is going to offer students more generous funding and support in terms of finding the right university. So if you apply for this new IIE placement model, it will give you more support in terms of helping you find your best fit university and also more support with the funding. So something to be aware of and check out more information on our website. Also on our website, we also have other scholarship searches under our postgraduate guide. So we've got different search engines that can help you kind of narrow down the thousands of scholarships that are available. And these might be available based on country of origin, field, etc. And these search engines allow you to find out more information about the eligibility. And then you'll want to refer to kind of each funding body's website for more information about the application process and any deadlines. So just some final funding tips as we conclude this section. As I've mentioned, applying for funding often happens simultaneous to the admissions process. So begin the search for funding early, and this will be part of your process all the way through. So make sure if funding is important to you, you need to be willing to put in the time and the effort to seek out and apply for funding opportunities. Scholarships typically don't find you unless you are a very lucky person where scholarships fall into your lap. So you'll need to investigate university funding and take the time to search for the often niche external scholarships. And you'll want to be really flexible in choosing your universities. If it's essential for you to receive funding to complete postgraduate study, you'll want to choose departments that have a lot of funding or where you are competitive as a top student. And if you're trying to get a sense of whether you're going to be competitive or not, you can take a look at websites. Sometimes they have kind of exam scores and grades of last year admitted students. And as I've mentioned before, but I'll mention again, just to make sure you've really got it in your head, for university funding, the best resource is going to be the university website, and making sure that you're looking in those three places: the departments page, the graduate school page, and the financial aid pages, checking all three in case not all the funding opportunities are advertised centrally. And then just kind of a final thing to keep in mind is that you can typically work on campus up to 20 hours per week during term time and up to 40 hours per week during the holidays, but you won't be able to use those expected earnings to be calculated for visa purposes when you're showing your proof of funds. So just something to be aware of. So now I'd like to talk about some other ways that, some additional ways that we can help. You've heard me mention our website several times throughout this presentation, and it really is the best place to go for advice and guides and more information on any upcoming events. So under this Going to the USA section, we have a postgraduate guide that takes you through the details of choosing funding, and applying in even more detail than I've gone into in this presentation this evening. In this Going to the USA section under postgraduate, you'll also find that Fulbright award section that details information about each award category, the benefits, the selection criteria, and the application procedures. We take questions by email, and we check our advising inbox kind of Monday to Friday. And so we can answer questions by email if you have any questions as you go along in the process. And we also offer one-to-one video appointments with an advisor. So if you go to the contact page on our website and kind of scroll all the way to the bottom, you can see the option to kind of book a one-to-one video appointment and get yourself booked in if you would like to talk about your specific circumstances with an advisor in more detail. We also offer a variety of different events throughout the year, mostly virtually at the moment, though we are hoping to be getting back to in-person events very soon. So either hosting our own events in person or being present at different fairs. And so you might be able to meet us in person one of these days. And with that, it wraps up the presentation part of the evening, and I can now open it up to any questions that any of you have in the Q&A box. I do ask that if you have questions, you try to keep them general so that they can be helpful for everyone. If you do have a very specific or niche question, you can always reach out to us separately by email. I'll put the email in the chat, but our email address is advising@fulbright.org.uk. And if any of you do kind of need to head off now, if you're not able to stay for the Q&A section, just a reminder that this has been recorded and the recording will be sent to you. And so you'll be able to kind of catch up on that at any point. And so with that, I'll stop sharing my screen so that you can see me more clearly. And I am going to, in the chat, put our email. I should also preface this to say that I had hoped to be joined by my colleague from the awards teams so that she could answer more specific questions about the Fulbright Awards and the funding that's available through that. She unfortunately wasn't able to join me. I will be able to answer kind of any basic questions about the Fulbright Awards, but if you have any kind of specific questions, I'll just put their email address in the chat box here. Their email address is programs, spelled PROGRAMMES, programs@fulbright.org.uk. So I'm just going to say, for questions about Fulbright Awards, email programs@fulbright.org.uk. And I see a couple of questions about this new IIE placement model that are coming into the chat. So I can't, like I said, I can answer some basic questions. I would definitely double check any of these answers from me with the awards team, just to make sure that you're getting the absolutely correct information. But people are asking if this new route is obligatory for a Fulbright Award, and whether you would be assigned to a particular institution or whether it's purely advisory to help you choose the best option. And so you are not required to apply to this new IIE placement model. You can still apply separately from that model. So at the time of application for the Fulbright Awards this year, you can decide if you're going to apply through the IIE placement model or if you're going to apply separately from that model. And you get to make that decision at that time. If you do decide to go through the IIE placement model, you get to work very closely with an advisor from IIE who's got lots of knowledge in this field and works very closely with you to determine how you can help find your best fit institution, both in terms of academics and your field and funding and all of that. And then they kind of help you through that process of choosing those institutions and applying to those institutions. And through that, there's more information on the Fulbright website, and so do check that out. Are there any? Those are the only questions that have come through so far. Don't know if anybody has other questions. What I'll do if anybody is kind of, I'll put the link to those so that you can find out more. So Fulbright postgraduate scholarships. So if you go to the website, it's going to have definitely the most accurate information. So definitely kind of double check anything that I've said there and check in with the awards team at that email address, just to be really sure. Somebody's asked if the timeline is the same. If you don't use this new model, the timeline will still be the same. And so if you are looking to apply for a Fulbright award that would, to fund your studies for autumn, starting in autumn 2023, that academic year, 2023-2024, you will be applying for the award in March through May. So applications opening in early May and applications opening in early March and closing at the end of May. And the timeline is available on the website for you to take a look at in more detail. Are there any other questions at the moment? Well, if you do have any questions that occur to you afterwards, feel free to reach out to us as Education USA advisors at advising@fulbright.org.uk for any questions about choosing funding and applying for your studies. And if you have any more specific questions about the awards, you can also reach out to the programs team, programs@fulbright.org.uk for any more specific questions about the awards. With that, I thank you all for coming this evening, and I hope you have a lovely evening. Thank you. Bye-bye.